So I'm delighted to have Martin Shaw with us here for today's research seminar. Martin Shaw is a professor here at IBEI. He's also an emeritus professor at Roehampton and comes to teach here at IBEI with us. He has written prolifically on world politics, genocide in particular, especially a very important book on what is genocide. He's published widely articles, books, including opinion pieces, and and is very busy on Twitter. So not afraid to have opinions. So this is a new book that he has out, Political Racism, which is a topic that he has turned to working on recently. So I'm going to pass the floor. Martin's going to explain the contents of the book to us.
Well, thank you, Leslie Ann. Well, thank you very much for coming today, and for those of you watching at home, good to have you with us. This, as Leslie Ann has suggested, this book, Political Racism, Brexit and Its Aftermath, is a bit of a departure for me, because my work in the last, 30 years or so has focused on war, conflict, and especially genocide, so on big international topics. And here I am writing about Brexit, which is of course an international topic, because it's about the exit of the UK from the European Union, but I'm writing about it particularly from the point of view of domestic politics and society, looking at the drivers of Brexit, and I'm particularly doing it through this idea of racism. So really just a very brief overview of the book before I come to what I'm trying to do and why. Just in summary, the book is about the roles and the consequences of racism. Maybe that should have had an inverted commas before political racism in general, but the political forms in particular in Brexit, both its origins and its development. And the approach, I call myself a historical sociologist. I approach international relations and politics from a broadly sociological point of view. In this study, I'm really integrating the results of a lot of different social science research and a lot of different publications of various kinds which have appeared over the last 6 years. My interest in the topic is considered to a considerable extent a personal one, because the United Kingdom, where I live, has undergone in the last 6 years a very fundamental political upheaval with big social and economic consequences. And my reason for writing this book at base is because I felt that there were important things that were not being fully understood, that were being underemphasized or misinterpreted in the development of Brexit and its effects in British politics and society. So this is the chapter outline of the book. In many ways, this is the key chapter, and this is where there's an element of original research on the propaganda of Brexit, which I carried out myself, but it's combined with other sources, because there are various sorts of materials. Essentially, the referendum is the hinge of this book, because in my view, this was a much more distinctive event, a much more interesting but troubling event in its own right than has been widely understood. It wasn't just a vote; it was a moment of big social and political catalyzing of underlying difficulties, and a moment of aggression and violence, which I'll come to in a minute. And my argument is really that the referendum was prepared by important forces in British society. So I have two chapters which are basically historical chapters about the forces, the history of these forces as they developed in the period since the Second World War, in the case of the immigration issue and the politics of racism, and over the last 3 decades or so in the case of what I call the Europhobic movement. I use the term Europhobic to refer to the movement which fundamentally rejects Europe and which sought the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union, as opposed to the more commonly used term Eurosceptic, which can be applied to people who still accept membership of the European Union. There are many Eurosceptics in European Union countries, but they don't all press for withdrawal. So the development of this distinct Europhobic movement. So these things come to a head in the referendum, and then really my later chapters are about the working out of these processes. Now, I think it's worth emphasizing, especially for a political science international relations audience, some of the ways, I mean, obviously there is a huge amount of interpretation of Brexit, but some of the ways in which Brexit has been understood by political scientists and the ways in which I differ from and criticize their work. So first of all, and so I'm saying actually there is a sort of consensus, a semi-consensus. Obviously there are lots of differences of interpretation, but a lot of settled opinion around some of these propositions. And this book, Maria Soleska and Rob Ford's book, Brexit Land, which is a very good book, very useful book, needs to be read, in many ways summarizes the arguments which a lot of other political scientists have contributed to. And their core argument is that there is electoral polarization in the United Kingdom between what they call identity conservatives and identity liberals, which is very much linked to the immigration issue. Identity conservatives tend to be anti-immigration and identity liberals tend to be in favor of it. Liberals include both ethnic minorities who are liberal because they are minorities, and in their argument, and also educated people who are liberal because of an ideology. And the opposition to immigration, which is expressed by so-called identity conservatives, is recognized as ethnocentric, but not generally racist. So a distinction is being made between ethnocentrism and racism. A third point, which is widely argued and is important, is that immigration flows themselves have caused racism, that immigration causes racism, that when large numbers of extra people come into the country from other countries, that causes anti-immigration politics. And it's also an important part of the common views of political scientists about this, that conflict within the right of British politics between especially the two wings of the Conservative Party or between the centrists of the Conservative Party and the right wing and UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which of course is a radical right party led in its heyday by Nigel Farage, who is a very significant figure that many of you probably heard of. But these conflicts played an important role. So this is all pretty well agreed, and critically interpreted, I agree with a lot of that. There are what I call apologetic versions of these arguments, which argue that the immigration concerns are legitimate concerns, and that the opposition to immigration represents racial self-interest. So that is the argument of Eric Kaufman, and this argument about that anti-immigration politics is basically legitimate is the argument of Matthew Goodwin and his co-author. And these authors are controversial and well known, and I mention them really because they are a significant part of the debate, but they're not really the main people that I'm arguing with. I'm arguing really with if you like, with the mainstream. And what I want to say before I leave that is that although the political gloss that people like Goodwin and Kaufman put on the mainstream arguments is a different one, because writers like Sobolewski and Ford and most other political scientists who write about these issues are basically liberals. Nevertheless, analytically, they share quite a lot of important ground. So this is my critique. First of all, there is a methodological bias towards the demand rather than the supply of anti-immigration politics. And this is a point which has been made as a general critique of the populism literature by Matthijs Rudin in an article a couple of years ago. And for me, this is an important point. Basically, Brexit is being blamed on the electorate, and the role of the political forces which helped to create this crisis and create actually a lot of the electoral polarization is being essentially underplayed. Secondly, I don't agree with the proposition that immigration causes anti-immigration politics. Immigration only causes anti-immigration politics if anti-immigration politics has already been primed. And I agree with Kaz Muda, who says that immigration has to be translated into a political issue before it becomes an active force in politics. I also criticizing really a lot of this literature for the avoidance of the idea of racism. I think that a lot of the literature is euphemistic. I think the term social conservative is euphemistic when what we're really talking about are attitudes to immigration which are extremely negative. We can go into all the meaning of that if you want to later, but I think that's unsatisfactory. I think this term national populism, which Goodwin, in fact, or Goodwin and Eastwell originate, is also euphemistic in the sense that it ascribes this populism to national identity, and it doesn't even say national. We don't even refer to the authors of this type of politics as nationalists, which is really what they are. It sort of semi-legitimates the idea. In particular, there is this problem of what is the role of racism? Well, if on the whole this literature is not talking about racism, when it does talk about it, it pigeonholes it. And people like Goodwin and Kaufman have developed a whole set of arguments to justify that. I think that on the whole, the more liberal political scientists don't really justify it at all. They simply operate with a very restricted idea of racism. So in the British context, Enoch Powell, for example, who is a very notorious racist politician of the 1960s and 70s, is regarded as a racist. But the literature will on the whole not apply that term to more recent figures, certainly like the mainstream figures like Boris Johnson and the leaders of the Leave campaign, who I'm going to talk about in a moment. And this seems to me to be an example of what Alana Lentin, who is a racism scholar, calls a frozen conception of racism, where the term racism is reserved to historical occurrences that everybody can see are bad, overt, like Powell or worse, the Nazis, and it is not applied to cases in which racism is slightly more covert, is slightly more subtly expressed, but nevertheless is very much present. So shall we move on? So my core arguments. I thought I'd first of all just summarize some of the core arguments and deal with one or two questions in a fairly general way before I get to some of the nitty-gritty. I think I regard Brexit as a secession, and it may be of interest to people within viewing this in Catalonia to consider the implications of that, although it's a very different case, of course. And so I emphasize really the agency of the right-wing political forces which have created this secession. I think this secession has involved a very distinctive ideological mix, but it's a mix which contains a whole number of different themes. And I have a whole chapter which is encapsulated in this sentence. So bear with me a little if I can't spell all of it out. But you have pro-American ideas, pro-Commonwealth ideas, the idea of the Anglosphere as an English-speaking world in which somehow the United Kingdom mediates between the former white dominions and the United States, and plays this sort of organizing role. More specialist ideas, like the idea of Kansuk, which is the idea that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, the core white dominions of the former British or the British Commonwealth, and the United Kingdom should be reunited in some sort of political entity. Rather fantastical idea, you might say. It combines these kinds of thinking with thinking which is still pro-NATO. That's quite an important point, actually, and also, of course, it's very much pro-free market. The free market neoliberal sort of strand runs very strongly through Brexit thinking. So I think it's important to look at the ways in which these ideas work together in Brexit. But my argument is very much that ideology doesn't really explain its success, that none of these ideas by themselves were sufficient really to justify and to popularize the proposal for the UK to leave the EU. In particular, they were not enough none of them really had mass popular appeal of a kind which would have mobilized the referendum majority. So really it comes down to this fusion of what I'm going to call and explain in a minute, political racism and Euroscepticism, Europhobia in a single campaign. So again, drawing on quite a lot of political science literature, I emphasize the ways in which the mainstream and radical right contributions to this mobilization have been intertwined in both of these tendencies, both the anti-immigrant political racist tendency, which has a long history going back to the 1950s and 60s, and the Europhobic tendency, and previously Eurosceptic tendency, which is almost as long but not quite. A key thing here is the role of the radical right, especially of Nigel Farage, in linking these things together, and in particular connecting immigration control to the question of EU freedom of movement, and making the demand to end freedom of movement, to end the free movement of especially East Europeans into the UK, a key part of the Europhobic campaign. So it's bringing these two things together, really, which was the key achievement of the radical right in the decade before 2016. But Brexit was won in 2016 because the Vote Leave campaign, which was the officially recognized campaign run, headed by Boris Johnson and other Conservative cabinet ministers involving some Labour MPs. This campaign, which was, if you like, the relatively mainstream majority campaign, compared to the minor Leave.eu campaign run by Farage and co. So Brexit was won because the Johnson Vote Leave campaign took on Farage's method. It adopted Farage's method of focusing on immigration in order to win majority support for leaving the EU. And very important to my argument, really, is the fact that this campaign produced racist aggression, which was widely noted at the time, and the consequence, I think, the consequences of this aggression, the mass mobilization of hostility especially to Europeans, but also to a considerable extent to migrants and minorities more generally, that was what the key thing in a way, which the campaign did beyond actually producing the votes. It generated this popular sentiment, and this popular sentiment then helped to lock in what was actually a very narrow result of the referendum, which, you know, a lot of commentators have said, well, really, since it was 52% to 48%, the logical outcome of this referendum for the government would have been for the government to say, well, yes, we're leaving the European Union, but we're going to stay in the single market and the customs union, the EU's customs union. You know, we're going to have a moderate break. But of course, what has happened is there's been a very fundamental break, a so-called hard Brexit. And my argument is that this character of the movement and the way it was expressed during and immediately after the referendum played a very important part in determining that outcome. And last but not least, and often I think neglected in some of the current British discussion, that Lee's victory was a big victory for immigration control. Enoch Powell, this notorious politician of the 1960s, campaigned to halt black immigration into the UK and to reverse it. He wanted to send people back. Farage and many of the other Europhobic anti-immigrant campaigners wanted to halt European Union immigration into the UK and to reverse it. And they have basically, to a very considerable extent, succeeded. There has been a very sizable drop in immigration from European Union countries into the UK, and there has been a significant departure of Europeans. And these things are a direct consequence of this campaign. They started to happen very dramatically in the late summer of 2016 and have been evident in the history since. So those are my core arguments. But I also to step back a little bit. I'll come back to the nitty-gritty of Brexit in a moment. But to step back, I think it's important to define concepts. I'm using, and so I have another chapter which is half about the ideas of racism and political racism, and relates them to the literatures of racism and also of right-wing, far-right politics in Western countries. And so I'm defining racism in a sense which is not simply about biological ideas. It's not. It's accepting that racisms typically involve both biological and cultural assumptions, and the precise mix is variable. I'm not adopting the frozen concept I referred to earlier. I'm seeing racism as a fluid concept, a floating signifier, as Stuart Hall once called it, which is, so it's a concept which is constantly filled with new content and doesn't have a sort of essential meaning. And so the targets of racism are not only whites. Whiteness is really important. Whiteness is still very much the structuring concept in contemporary racism, but the targets are not only people of color. Other populations can be racialized. And I mean, this will be a familiar point to anybody who's following the debates, but it's important to say, I suppose, that racism is not just an individual, everyday, or even an intentional thing. It's also institutional, structural, and systematic. And of course, saying that sort of thing upsets some people on the far right of politics, but that's again very much the contemporary consensus of scholars. Important this, though, race is generally viewed as a technology of power. It's an idea which involves really a weapon. It's something which is used against minorities, against groups that are discriminated against. But what I want to say is, that that may be generally true, but there are distinctive political uses. That political racism, as I call it, sorry, is a distinctive form of racism, and these are some of the things I want to say. So this is my fairly simple definition of it: the deployment of hostility to achieve, maintain, or transform political power. I think it's important because it's a continuing element of organized or intentional racism. So institutional, structural, systematic forms of racism are generally seen as being deeply embedded in social practices and not necessarily coordinated or intentionally organized in any way. They can exist without those elements. And some of the more obvious intentional forms of racism or organized forms of racism of the past have been discredited. You know, we don't have many states or societies that are organized on the lines of Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa or even Jim Crow, although there are some survival. So this is something which is going on despite the fact we've moved away from some of those most obvious forms of organized and intentional racism. I'm arguing that it's central to racism in democracies, and especially where racism has been delegitimized. And that is true of more or less in Western societies, at least today. And it was true in the United Kingdom in 2016. Most people before 2016 saw this as a society which, not if not post-racial, was one in which a lot of liberalization had occurred. So this is something which goes on even when the formal institutional order is delegitimizes racism and indeed may legitimize anti-racism, may include all sorts of prohibitions on overt racism. And I argue it's particularly central to racism in democracies. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. We could trace this back over a century or so, but it's something which is still very important. It's very important today, and obviously linked to nationalism. Nationalism, if racism is not entirely legitimate in overt forms, then nationalism is a very, very important framework within which racist ideas can be propagated and justified. And one of the things I want to argue about political racism in relation to institutional, structural, societal racism is that it helps to sediment and reinforce these like more fundamental social forms of racism. So, for example, 7 decades of what I call political racist campaigning in British society and through the British press have helped to lay down racist ideas which are activated by new campaigns. So, and just briefly, I try to pick out elements of political racism. Strategic mobilization, typically by parties, leaders, partisan media, including ad hoc campaigns like the Leave campaigns. At the top of my tree here, but a whole range of other forces need to be activated really to make them work. And of course, the other thing to say, I suppose, is that these things impact on each other. In a process like the Brexit referendum, the strategic mobilization is key because this is a moment of maximum political pressure and of concentration of forces. But at other moments in time, ideologues, social media activists, street level activists and far right groups and so on, and of course various forms of mainstream media can all help to gear up this form of political racism. I won't stress, I think a lot of this is fairly obvious, so I won't stress it more at this particular moment, but if you want to ask about it, come back. So, shall we move on? As I now dive in a little bit more concentrated way into the referendum and the aftermath of the referendum, this is to introduce it. This is, of course, Nigel Farage, and this is him introducing his most notorious poster, which depicts actually Syrian refugees on the continent of Europe, but is being used by this British far-right organization to legitimate ending immigration or reducing immigration in the UK. The important thing about this poster is that this has been seen as the emblematic racist moment of the referendum campaign. And it has helped to solidify the view that Farage is the leading racist. And one of my motivations really is to question this. So again, there is a quasi consensus, I think, a lot of media commentators, but also scholars. First of all, immigration was important in the Leave campaign. That has been recognised, but it's been seen as secondary to the issue of sovereignty. Secondly, that the role of racism as such was minor and temporary. So this aggro that I was talking about at the end of the referendum campaign and immediately afterwards is seen as a momentary disturbance. And racism as a political thing was perpetrated by the Leave.eu campaign led by Farage, not by Vote Leave. So this is a consensus, and I quote loads of different sorts of liberal and left-wing people in the book who say, especially the second thing, identify the racist element with the far right. And so my argument in opposition to this is that, first of all, sovereignty was interpreted in terms of immigration to a very large extent. It was the primary way in which sovereignty was interpreted in the campaign for the mass of voters. And the key slogan, "Take Back Control," which the notorious Dominic Cummings, then organizer of the Leave campaign, Vote Leave campaign, is credited with having invented, was effectively equated with immigration control. But this slogan, in fact, had been used, the very slogan that was identified with Vote Leave had been used by Farage over a number of years. And so my second argument really is that immigration was central to the Vote Leave and the Tory tabloid press campaigns, as well as the Leave.eu campaign. So what I try to do is to show in some detail what the Vote Leave campaign was about and how it tied up with the tabloid press. The British tabloids have long been recognised as a really problematic element of British political life and culture, British institutions. And in this particular instance, they played a very, very tightly coordinated, linked and coordinated role with in relation to Vote Leave, and using a lot of studies that have been done of their campaigns, I'm able to show these links. So in response to the potential criticism that I'm ascribing too much to the agency of the Vote Leave campaign and the political right, I mean, what I'm saying really is that there's this very major media reinforcement which played a crucial role. And I go in detail into how Vote Leave, the immigration arguments were the key arguments of Vote Leave, how it had two levels of Vote Leave propaganda about immigration. On the one hand, there was the argument presented by Boris Johnson himself in his speeches that immigration needed to be managed more effectively, and that couldn't be done in the EU. On the other hand, there was very, very lurid, sensationalist propaganda in a huge number of Facebook advertisements. Over 1 billion were claimed, and no real reason to doubt that figure. And also in broadcasts that were put out on mainstream television. So my argument compared to this is really that this was a campaign in which phenomenally to a phenomenally high extent, immigration was central not only to the supposedly far-right element, but also to what was supposed to be the mainstream right element of this campaign. And so, I'm arguing, yes, again, I've already made the point that Farage's link was taken over by what was supposed to be part of the mainstream. And just to reinforce these points a little, David Cameron, of course, was the Conservative Prime Minister who called the referendum and campaigned against Vote Leave. This is what he said 3 years later in his memoirs. They might as well have said, if you want a Muslim for a neighbour, vote Remain. And this is a reference to the previous very notorious campaign in British politics 50 years earlier, and echoed by remarks of Farage. I mean, I just brought these up for illustration of a particular theme. I think what's important, I do address this quite a bit in the book, the fact that Cameron and the Remain campaign, including the Labour Party, which ran its own campaign, did not really counter the anti-immigration politics of the Leave campaigns. They simply focused on the economics and hoped that by ignoring immigration, they would somehow manage to sideline it, and it didn't work. So, many racisms of Brexit. Now, I've got here at the top there a quote from Nigel Farage a year after the referendum, a reflective quote. And this represents, I suppose, a key argument that was made by not only by Farage but also by a lot of the right wing, that the concern about immigration was not racist; it was about numbers. And what I want to suggest is that although this is a very important strand in the whole thing, the idea of numbers and numerical limits as key, and that it was something which Farage and the Tory right have managed to get the government to embed in a net migration target. So this effect ostensibly deracinates anti-immigrant politics. It turns it into something about the numbers of people in the society rather than the particular groups. But I would argue it is also combined with all these different forms of racism and racialization. Historic anti-black racism, which of course by this time has been very alive for 5 or 6 decades in British society ever since the 1950s. By 2016 was largely delegitimized. This is what Farage is talking about. He says it's not we weren't being overtly racist, and it had been to some extent replaced by this racialization of the idea of immigrants, which can be traced back, has been traced back by the literature to the early post-Second World War period in which black Commonwealth migrants into the UK started to be referred to as immigrants, and immigrant started to be used as a dirty word by the press and the political right, and which has now been extended to the idea of asylum seekers, which is treated in very much the same way. But then there are also more specific racisms. There's particularly anti-Muslim racism, as the Cameron quote suggested, was especially after 9/11, the acceptable face of anti-black racism. And of course, this is a core racism of the international right, far right and right wing. The Islamophobia has been a form of racism which they found they are able to make acceptable and to arouse a great deal of support in society. But in the case of Brexit, of course, this is combined with anti-East European racism. This is a specific British homegrown racism, although I dare say that East Europeans are racialized in some other countries, or have been in the past. It includes more specified versions, particularly, for example, against Poles and Romanians, especially Poles because they were the largest group in this migration into the UK in the 21st century, and the Romanians because they were essentialized in particularly horrible ways generally. But then Brexit has tended to arouse all sorts of other historic as well as novel forms of racism, Germanophobia, which has been a sort of festering element in British society ever since the Second World War. It was very much stirred up again by the press and by the Brexit campaigners in comparisons between the European Union and the Nazi order in Europe. And anti-Irish racism, which was aroused after the referendum in the conflict, and still is being, of course, aroused in the conflict over the Irish border. And I think it's interesting to think, I would say British attitudes to the Irish map moderately well onto Russian attitudes to the Ukrainians. You know, they're a neighboring people who used to be part of the empire, who really oughtn't to be separate. And there was a lot of that in the period, especially in the years from about 2017 to 2019. But of course, it's been stirred up again recently in the arguments around the protocol. And this is at an elite level as well as a popular level. And then a general anti-Europeanism. Anti-European, East European racism had been mobilized over the previous decade in British society. And despite a bit in the book about, there's a lot of research by anthropologists about that, which I draw on. But in 2016, this turned into something a bit broader. It became anti-Europeanism itself. There was a lot of hostility to the use of European languages in certain sorts of contexts. And of course, it was expressed in the official treatment of EU citizens. So what do I argue after this? I argue that these forms of political racism that have been mobilized in Brexit then become drivers of the post-Brexit developments, that Britain has gone in a particular way because of these things which came to a head in 2016. So the Conservatives became a Europhobic party. The Conservatives in the middle of the 20th century were the most European or pro-European of the British parties. By the beginning of the 21st century, they were overwhelming Eurosceptic, but mostly still in favour of membership of the European Union. As a result of Brexit and the rise to power of Boris Johnson, they have become entirely Europhobic, and all their most noteworthy Europhiles or supporters even of EU, historic supporters of EU membership, have been tended to be forced out. And so my argument is really that this political racism, which was mobilized in 2016, then fed into the Conservative Party and drove the way in which the Conservative governments of Theresa May and then Boris Johnson hardened Brexit, rejected any idea of any sort of compromise on the single market, and opened the way to the sort of radicalization the results of which we see today. I'm obviously skating over a lot here, but I suppose in terms of my analytical framework, what I'm saying here is that political racism, which was mobilized originally strategically, but then had broad popular resonance, then becomes embedded in the ruling party and drives a sort of policy racism, bureaucratic racism, if you like, especially against Europeans. And I think we can see this alongside this, a broader mobilization of various forms of political racism by the Conservatives in the consolidation of the Johnson regime. I really wanted to call the book Brexit and the Rise of the Nationalist Tory regime, or the Johnson regime. I couldn't put Johnson in the title because we never quite knew whether he was going to go before the book came out. And in the end, I settled for something that was that wouldn't date too quickly. But he came to power through using anti-Muslim racism, through Burqagate, through his deliberate remarks attacking Muslim women who wore the burqa, which were then recycled in the political process at key moments in his leadership and general election victories. The victory of the Conservatives in the 2019 election, which was basically a get Brexit done election, meant this was a victory in which anti-Europeanism and anti-Semitism, that's another quite related issue that I can't really go into, but nevertheless played an important part. It wasn't this general election campaign wasn't a full-blown political racist anti-immigration campaign in the way that the referendum campaign had been. In a sense, these arguments were baked into what, of course, Johnson called his oven-ready Brexit. There are a lot of arguments going on today in British politics and the literature around British politics about the kind of immigration policy which this has led to with the Johnson regime. There are elements of liberalisation. So Johnson has got rid of the numerical target, basically because it was unworkable and had caused enormous embarrassment to his two predecessors. He has made a relatively liberal offer to Hong Kongers to come to the UK, and also liberalised to some extent the conditions for professional middle class workers, highly skilled workers, people like doctors. But of course, at the same time, continuing the hostile environment for most migrants. That term hostile environment, of course, was an official policy term. It has now been re-euphemized, but it is basically still the policy. And of course, for EU migrants, no time to talk in detail about this, but EU migrants to the UK now have totally inferior conditions to those which they had before. And of course, populist campaigning around immigration and race issues remains a central political feature of the Johnson regime. I mean, it's a government which has been described as governing through campaigning, and it campaigns, always falls back, and when it's in a particular difficulty, on campaigning around particularly provocative racist policies, like the latest one, of course, being to deport asylum seekers, refugees who arrive on British shores to Rwanda. So my argument is that there is essentially the direction which produced the 2016 result remains embedded in this regime. There are those who say that there is a sort of liberalisation of public attitudes taking place, and that the policy context is changing. I'm largely sceptical about those arguments, because I think basically any liberalisation, partial liberalisation that's taking place, or what I would call selective racism, is based on the victory for racism which was achieved in the referendum and has defined the course of the regime. So I think I've probably been going on too long. Some concluding and partially comparative thoughts. I think it's worth remembering that this is the only far-right leaning regime in power in a major Western state. I've used this term far-right leaning because there is, of course, there's a debate about terminology here. Cas Müller, who writes about the contemporary far right, uses these categories of mainstream, radical, and extreme right. So radical and extreme are both varieties of far right. He recently described the American Republican Party as a conservative far-right hybrid. And I think that more or less fits the conservatives, British conservatives as well, as a result of these processes. And certainly very significant far-right ideas and far-right modes of mobilization in this party. In their reaching this outcome, though, the only regime of this type was in power in a major Western country. I mean, clearly there are others in other places like India, which we could compare. The significance of secessionism or secessionist nationalism, I think, is important. I don't think it's certainly not easy to see how this political development would have happened without this element. As a passing note, I think it's also important to think about the role of the first past the post electoral system in producing or enabling these kinds of outcomes, as well as the referendum policy. The referendum, of course, is the striking element, but underlying that and around it and following it is the first past the post system. This question about, I mentioned before that the Brexiters are still very much pro-NATO, which distinguishes them from Trump. And this is, so Britain is having this experiment in this context, which is quite rather different really from that in the United States or India for that matter, where, I mean, Britain is really a second-tier state, and it is located in Europe, and it does face the same challenges, more or less, that other European states face. So its European location is important about it. So somehow what they are trying to do is to combine Make Britain Great Again, which is basically what it's about, or Global Britain, of course, is the slogan, with continuing Atlanticism and NATO philia. There's the question of the role of Johnson himself as a unique political figure, and and what will happen when he does go. He was called Britain Trump. That was Trump's actual words by Donald Trump. Clearly, I mean, Johnson. If Trump had stayed in power, or if Johnson or his similar successor is still in power when Trump comes back in 24, if that happens, they will orient back to Trump, no doubt about it. But at the moment, they're constrained. They have to adapt to a Biden-led democratic NATO, broad democratic NATO. And of course, it's a very vulnerable regime as well. So, and of course, it hasn't gone as far, or maybe can't go, as the Republicans in gerrymandering and voter suppression. So the American Republicans have got a clear route to mobilizing the large racist minority in American society to win power in conjunction with these other methods. The British Conservatives are essentially going down the same route, but they don't quite have the same tools at their disposal. So, but I suppose my bottom line would be that given all the other problems they've got, that this political racism that I'm talking about will almost certainly come back in a serious way in the UK in the next couple of years. Yes.
All right,
thank you.